Hey dudes, what's going on? It's Solar, and today we are going to be doing the last of what I would probably describe as the boring or introductory or whatever you want to call them tutorials. I know when you first start getting into a program, the first few lessons are pretty slow because you have to explain the basics. I'm assuming people know nothing about frame rates, footage, composition settings, all that kind of stuff. So please do bear with me. This will hopefully be the last one of what I consider like the basic lessons, and then we can get on to some of the more fun stuff. But it's you can't run before you can walk, as they say, and I totally believe that to be the truth, which is why I taught Photoshop before we start doing the After Effects ones, because I feel that's a good foundation, as I keep banging on about. So today what I'm going to be doing is just explaining what these two windows do in full. I mean, yesterday, or in the last lesson, whenever you watched it, I explained about the zooming in on the timeline and a couple of things in here in terms of getting to the footage. But I'm just going to explain a few things here as to how this kind of stuff works. So, as I said in the last lesson, this here basically hides your footage. The eyes, just as in Photoshop, is like if you turn something off, this is an adjustment layer. I'll explain that in another day. Basically, it applies effects to everything that's underneath. So instead of applying effects or filters to each one of these three layers individually, I apply it to this adjustment layer, and because all these three layers are underneath, they will all get affected by what in this case is color correction. So again, that's another thing for another day, but I mean, it's pretty simple. This here, as if a video has any sound, you can click and go to audio, and if you keep going down, you will see the waveform. Now, even though this says that I have sound in the file, you can see that there's no waveform, so I don't particularly need any of that audio. But if you have a piece of music that you bring onto the timeline, you would obviously want that ticked so that when you play back your footage, you can hear the music. Solo is the next one. This allows you to view just the clip. So let's say that, for argument's sake, I have all three of these clips lined up. So as you can see, the solid area of my layer is visible, which means all three of these are visible, but I can only see the one that's on top, obviously, as we explained before. As you go down, the top layer will always be visible unless it's transparent, in which case you can toggle the transparency. I'm just pressing T to bring up the opacity there. You know that you can find it in transform, which is what I explained yesterday, but there are shortcuts to get to all of these. So T brings up opacity, S brings up scale, P brings up position, R brings up rotation, A brings up anchor point, and is there anything else? Opacity, rotation, scale, position. No, that's all of them. And L brings up the audio levels. So useful little shortcuts to know. But yeah, so what Solo will do is if I have things stacked in a layer order, I can just view those things individually. So even though these are still visible, as you can see, they've been grayed out because I'm temporarily only viewing this, which is why even though it's beneath these two layers, I can still see it. So that's really useful. If this right here is the padlock, so this will basically make all these layers unselectable. I would do this once you have like maybe an adjustment layer locked and you don't want to toggle it by accident. Pretty useful. And again, if you're happy with something on your timeline, you can always like lock it just in case you don't want to touch it by accident. Pretty simple stuff. Moving on, this right here is the shy button, and I'm still to this day not quite sure what this is, whether it's meant to be like a little peeping face over a film strip. Is that a nose? Are those eyes? Who knows? But what this does is super useful. So I'm just going to undo until I have my footage back in some kind of order here. So I'm just hitting Control Z. There we go. So we've got our footage back in order. And what this does is if I select shy, so turn this on, it should go blue. Like nothing's happened at the moment, but what happens is if I click something, with the shy button, it won't appear on the timeline. Now, why would I do that? So as you can see, the footage is still there, but we just can't see it. And as you can see here, now the kind of face is hidden behind the mask. So why would I do this? So once you get to the point where you have like tens or maybe hundreds of layers in a composition, and some of them you don't need to see, like once they've been, again, much like locking it, let's say I'm happy with this adjustment layer, I could make it shy, so do that. And at the moment I can still see it because this isn't ticked, but I could also lock it. So what this means is that I can go on editing these freely, and the layer is still there. As you can see, 2, 3, 4, the layer still exists, but it's just hidden from my timeline. And this just allows you to kind of neaten up what you've got going on here. Again, once these pieces of footage are locked and maybe I don't want to see them on the timeline, I can just do that and work on, you know, like maybe then I want to make a new text layer, so call this footage, and you know, that way I can just kind of concentrate on placing my text and working with that, knowing the footage is still here, and if I want to access it I can just click that to reveal it all. But you know, maybe I don't want it on my timeline and I want to keep stuff clean, so that's why you would do that. So I'm going to unclick that. Effects here, basically if your layers have effects on, you can turn them on and off really quick by doing this. So let's have a look here. On this we have a vignette, a curves, an unsharp, a vibrance, and a noise. These are just filters, but if I wanted to turn those off temporarily, I could do that, or I could just, in this case, turn the adjustment layer off. But let's say you had all those effects applied to a specific layer, you can just turn them on and off with this. The effects dialog is not open for these layers because I have no effects applied to them. So that's that. Next up you have frame blending. That's to do with time remapping, so speeding things up and slowing things down. That's a more advanced lesson. Motion blur I'll go over when we do animation. This is the adjustment layer. So an adjustment layer basically, as I explained earlier, affects everything underneath it. So if I turn that off, this just becomes a regular layer and pretty useless, whereas if I turn it on, then I get to apply all the effects I have to it to the layer underneath. So it's kind of cool. And this last is the 3D layer. So just to show what that does real quick, if I go to transform, now as you saw yesterday when I was moving things around, I can move things left and right, I can rotate things like this, sideways, and all that kind of stuff. But if I click 3D here, watch what happens to position. You see how suddenly we've got a load of extra menus. We have X rotation, Y rotation, Z rotation, orientation, and we've got an extra parameter in the position and scale. What this means is that I can now rotate the layer in 3D, which is kind of like this, and I can move it backwards by going, so this is kind of like doing scale but not quite. So what that does is it just basically gives me the option to move the layer around in 3D, which has massive implications, especially with text. It's like super useful. So that's good to know. I'm just going to reset here, so if you click reset, it moves everything back to the middle, which is also kind of useful. Okay, so that's the 3D panel. We've explained all that. This is the flowchart. I'll explain about that when we do pre-comps. Draft 3D, I would like not use this. Hopefully like computers are fast enough that you don't need this now. Shy, I've explained earlier, just hides all the layers that are shied. Frame blending is, like I said, we'll get to that when we're time remapping footage. Motion blur when we get to animation. And the graph editor is, again, I'll touch on this when we do animation, but that kind of explains everything down here. Now, you see here we have a toggle switches mode, and this kind of switches the things around in our menu, which can be quite confusing. So if you're looking for blending modes, and if you remember what these are from the Photoshop tutorials, we've got like add, so we can add like two clips together, like the brightness of them, like that. We can add the darkness, so the dark levels, like overlay the two dark levels. We can change it to overlay and all that kind of stuff, which I explain in the Photoshop tutorials. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe check there. We have matte, which is actually a mask, which I'll explain in another lesson. And then we have parenting, which again, I can explain briefly now, but I'll explain in a completely different lesson what that is. So what happens with parenting is, let me just select these two layers and press P. Now I'm going to make the top layer here a parent of the other one, and what I'm going to do is change this to screen so that we can see this one, and screen means I can like multiply all the brightness over the bottom clip, which is why we're seeing this kind of like overlaid effect of both videos at once. And by making one layer a parent of the other, so this is now the parent, as you can see here, this bottom footage has this footage as parent, and now if I move this top one left, the bottom clip is moving with it, even though you don't see that reflected in the numbers. As you can see, if I undid that and change this to none and move the top clip, so we would be moving the top clip but not the bottom clip. But if again I select layer number 2, or you can just use this pick whip, you'll see if I move the top layer, that moves with it. If I scale this down, they'll both scale down at the same size. Rotate, they'll both rotate at once. The opacity is not, it will not follow in opacity, so just be aware if you fade one down, it won't fade the other one down. But there's tons of implications for this when we come to doing animation, which I'll explain another day. And then track matte is when you use one layer to mask another, which is a lesson all in itself. So that's the timeline panel. Now let me quickly explain what's going on in the footage window, because I want to get over this kind of stuff as soon as possible. So this here is your grids, but what you can do is hit the colon key on it's not the colon key, it's next to the colon key, but let me just, so you can do the proportional grids, you can do the title safe, you can have the grids, guides, rulers, whichever one you want to see. There's shortcuts for this on the keyboard, so control and the, for me it's the at key and the colon key. It's basically the one to the right of the L key on your keyboard, 2 to the right, sorry. So you have the colon to the right of the L, and then if you go one further you have the key that does this. And if I press it by itself, you will turn on this kind of grid. If I press control, you will get the actual proper grid. So you can toggle those on and off with this as well. The next one is the layer controls. As you can see here, I can see my corners and move this layer around. I can see where the middle is, so if I want to move it around. If we turn this off, doesn't really affect these per se, but once we start to, if I draw a mask, and if you don't know what a mask is, we will get to that. So this basically allows you to just view a certain area of that layer. So here we have a mask, and this allows me to basically hide all the controls for my mask if it starts to get messy. So I have the layer selected. If I toggle this on and off, as you can see, I can see or hide my mask, which can be kind of useful or not, as the case may be. If we move further on, this is the time, which is kind of reflected here as well. You can drag this up and down. This is super useful. So say you want to compare one part of your composition to another. So let's say I want to compare this frame. If I click here, I'm not sure if you heard that, but there was like a noise, and then we come to here and we want to quickly view that, and it's super useful. And you can basically compare one frame of your video to another. So there's many implications for that, and I'm sure you can think of those yourself. The next menu is the color channels of your video. So just like in Photoshop, you can view the color information. So what we have here is we have the RGB, which is just our normal image, but if you remember from the Photoshop tutorials, each image is made up of a red, a green, and a blue channel, and it can be useful to view these, and obviously an alpha, which is the transparency, which is at the moment all white because we can see everything. So it's useful if you press Alt 1, 2 and 3, you can jump through these, and then just press Alt 1 again or 2 or whichever one you press again to get back to RGB. And it's useful to be able to view these channels on the fly if you just want to compare how much noise is in each channel, or which one has the best contrast if we're coming to making a mask, or a matte in this case, as it's called. Again, that's all quite advanced stuff, but I just want to make you aware of this. The whole point of this video is you can always come back and watch it. A lot of this is not going to make sense right now, but I want to cover everything because I don't want to have to come back and explain this kind of stuff again. Full is the, if I zoom out here, is the resolution at which you're viewing your footage. So by viewing it at full, you're viewing it at like the highest quality possible. And this is great if you want to see like a preview of the final image quality and what it will look like. But sometimes you have a slow computer or there's lots going on and you just want to preview stuff really quick, in which case you can knock this down to custom, and what this will do is preview a lot faster. But obviously we're getting pixelated images because it's only showing this video at a quarter of the resolution that it should be. And this is kind of great if you want to preview stuff really quick. Auto will basically just preview the size that you have zoomed in. So if you're at a quarter resolution, i.e. 25%, it will only like preview the video at that size. Here it'll preview at half, and if you're fully zoomed in, it'll preview at full. So that's kind of useful. So I usually leave it on auto. This is the region of interest. If you press it once, your cursor changes to kind of this box, and what this allows me to do is just preview within this window. So again, this is a tool for speeding up your workflow if you have a slow computer. If I come to the corners, I can view this, and maybe I just want to preview this area. So what this will do is when I'm previewing my footage, it will just ignore everything outside here and just let me see what's in here, which will help my preview times a lot. If you want to turn it off, just come here and turn it off. The transparency is if you have, let me hide. Again, if I have my video masked to the point where there's nothing behind it and I toggle this, we can just preview on black or this kind of grid, which you should recognize from Photoshop, which just means transparent. Even if you toggle this on and off, the video is still transparent, but this will allow me to see it on the color of whatever my background is in my composition. So if you come to composition settings, you can change the color of this background to white or red or whatever you want. But you have the option at the end when you render the video to render this color if you have transparency there, or you can just render on transparent, which will basically allow you to have transparency information there. But if I delete this mask, we'll see we don't really need that setting. Cameras is for 3D stuff, so you won't really need that right now. Aspect ratio, again, you shouldn't need that. Fast previews, this is basically how quick and different ways of previewing your footage. I would leave it adaptive if you have a slow computer, or off final quality if you have some quick graphics cards. So you know, adaptive resolution will basically, as you can see, as I scrub through this, it will change things to the kind of like blocky, as you can see. I'm not sure if this will show up in my video, but as I preview really quick, the videos, as I scrub on the timeline, will be pixelated, and then it'll kind of, as I let go, smooth it out, and it just speeds up the way, whereas here it will try and play everything smoothly, no pixelation. So again, I have a fast computer, so I don't really need to leave this anything off than final quality, which is the best one. The timeline we have here, so you shouldn't really need the composition flowchart, is more trouble than it's worth, if I'm honest. And then last but not least, you have the option to temporarily increase the exposure of your timeline. So what this is good for is if you're just kind of trying to view either a video that's really dark, or maybe you know the video's bright but your monitor's too dark, you can temporarily just increase the brightness, and this will not show in the final video. It's just for the kind of timeline viewer. So sometimes it's really useful to view things like to quickly crank up your exposure to see if you've got like too much noise in somewhere, or if there's any problems in your compositing, and then you just click here to reset it. So I can quickly view this image like super bright, and if I want to turn it back, I just click there. So there we go. I'm sorry this was a long one, it's 20 minutes, but by explaining these two back to back, I think that once we get onto the next stuff, we can pretty much start jumping in and doing animation and fun stuff that you guys can actually use in your workflow. But hopefully by now you should understand how to bring in footage, how to make a composition, what size that composition should be based on your footage, and then on the timeline, what everything on here does, and how to manipulate the footage as well, so we know all about the transform and all these parameters. And hopefully on the next lesson we can get on to how you would animate something, and hopefully you know what all these kind of things here mean. So thanks for watching, guys. Sorry it was a long one. Hopefully you've learned a lot of stuff from this. I did cover a lot of stuff, but you know, you can always come back and watch it again. I probably suggest coming back and watching this video again in like a week or a month, once you've properly got your head around the program, and you might have forgotten some of the things on here, and then when you come back you're like, oh, he did cover that, and this is what that does, and oh, now I know how timelines and filters work. Actually, a lot of these features were quite useful. I realize right now they're probably not, but hopefully when you come back and watch this again in a few weeks, a lot of this video will make more sense. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial.